Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Andrea Sankes in Paris. Will a new regime mean a new strategy in the war on terror? Well, my guest tonight hopes so. Ian Shapiro has written a book on the subject, advocating containment over military confrontation to combat terrorism. He says the U.S. has used containment successfully before in cases of the Cold War and Libya. He'd now like the Obama administration to change course and try it again. Ian Shapiro is a Sterling Professor of Political Science at Yale University, and he joins me now on the interview. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Andrea.
Why is containment the way to proceed, and how would it actually work in the context of the war on terror?
So the reason we should pursue containment is it's really the only viable basis for dealing with terrorism. Many people say it's a Cold War relic and it has nothing to do with the sorts of conflicts we face. But you only have to look at the success we had with containment in Iraq between 1991 and 2003, or in Libya in rendering Gaddafi's threat de minimis, to see that it can work very well in the post-Cold War period.
Was that success in Iraq up till 1993?
Yes. We now know definitively, although many people argued at the time, that the containment regime put in place by Bush Sr. after Iraq was expelled from Kuwait was highly effective. Saddam Hussein, it turned out, had no weapons of mass destruction and posed no threat to any of his neighbors, let alone to the U.S. or any of its allies.
But the fundamental difference there is that there was an enemy defined by a state. Our enemies in the war on terror do not identify with states. And in fact, the states that many of them are located in, as far as we know, also despise the governments under which those states are run.
You make an excellent point, because to some extent containment can work against terrorist groups by controlling or containing the enabling states. But when we're dealing with weak or failed states, the Somalias of this world, the Pakistans of this world, that may not be possible. And in those contexts, it's particularly important that containment work with regional powers and through international institutions if it's going to be effective. So I think in the case of, we're looking forward now to the new American administration, and Barack Obama's talking about withdrawal from Iraq in 16 months. Well, unfortunately, as a result of the last administration's policies, we've produced a failed state in Iraq, and we have to think about a containment strategy for post-occupation Iraq as the American forces draw down. That's not going to happen unless we work with the Syrians and unless we work with the Iranians, who themselves have an interest in containing the terrorist threats that are likely to exist in post-containment Iraq.
Other than Iraq, though, identify so we can better understand these enabling states. I mean, what about Saudi Arabia then? What about Pakistan? These are still technically, you could see those as enabling states because there are allegedly parts of their regime that do foster terrorism, yet they are still allies of the U.S.
Well, I think the most successful model for containing and enabling terrorist state in recent years has been Libya. After all, Libya in the 1990s was a perpetrator of terrorism, a haven for terrorists.
But that was an established state working directly with terrorist elements.
Yeah.
We don't have that. What do we have today?
So when we're thinking about failed states, I think the example would be in the last several decades has been Lebanon, where we worked quite successfully, again, with the Syrians, although Americans don't like to admit this, but, the Syrians came into Lebanon at the invitation of Henry Kissinger, and for a long time the one-liner in Washington was only the Syrians can hold Lebanon together. And what the Bush administration did in getting behind forcing the Syrians out of Lebanon without having a plan to disband Hezbollah was simply to make the weak state problem worse. This only goes to say we're often choosing among second-best solutions, and we have to work with the non-failed states surrounding a failed state if we're going to minimize the terrorist fallout from the failed states.
Sounds complicated, huh?
Very complicated, but necessary.
Explain the difference then between containment and isolationism. You're not in any way suggesting isolationism.
Correct. I think America has to be engaged in the world. America needs to be a force for good in the world, and America needs to support democratic movements around the world. You do that, as Kennan argued a long time ago when he first developed the doctrine of containment in the 1940s, by two things. One, demonstrating the success of democratic capitalism on the ground, rather than trying to ram it down people's throats at the point of a gun. And second, facing down the forces of domination. So the slogan is, stop the bully without yourself becoming a bully. So we would say that George Bush Sr.'s policy when Iraq invaded Kuwait is a textbook case of post-Cold War containment, in that we stopped the aggression. We did what was necessary to do it, but we didn't start engaging in gratuitous regime change of the sort the younger Bushes attempted.
Okay, then in a sense, is the United States containing Hamas? And is that working?
So sometimes containment has to work with engagement. Just as during the Cold War we both had to contain China and engage with China. I think of Hamas in a very similar way. Like it or not, Hamas has the legitimacy on the ground in the West Bank and Gaza. They've demonstrated this through the ballot box. Hamas is itself a divided movement, with some elements in the leadership favoring morphing into a government and shedding terrorist goals and ambitions, while others still see themselves as a terrorist organization. We have to give the more moderate leadership in Hamas both the incentives and the means to succeed, at the same time as we make it clear we won't tolerate the aggressive terrorist tactics. In that sense, I think dealing with Hamas is really presents the same mix of challenges as dealing with the Iranian leadership.
Okay, in the larger scope of things, though, I mean, is it not too late to suggest and to use containment, considering the military confrontation began years ago and is nowhere near over?
Too late where?
Well, I mean, in the sense, Iraq, for example. How can you start a containment process when the military confrontation has already begun and is expected to continue?
No, we abandoned containment in 2003 when we invaded Iraq. We now have a largely unsuccessful war that has produced a state that may well be unable to hold together once the Americans leave, which President Obama still claims will occur 16 months from now. So we now have to think forward. What is our policy in the region going to be, given that we've now created a very weak state that may start to look like Yugoslavia when it started to break up after 1989. It's become a magnet for terrorist groups since the American invasion in 2003, and we're going to be in a position of having to contain what possible threats can emanate from this new Iraq, the post-occupation Iraq, and I think there we're going to have to work with the Syrians and with the Iranians to contain those threats.
And you think an Obama administration will choose containment over confrontation?
The jury's still out. It seems likely that they will. I certainly hope that they will. We don't really have the resources for a massive confrontation with Iran, which is what would be required to go down the path that the Bush administration has been going down. One of the biggest costs of the Iraq war has been the massive display of American weakness. Our inability to quell that country has emboldened Iran, has emboldened the Syrians, and we have a lot of work backing and filling to do to repair those relationships so that they operate in America's interests.
Okay. You are a native of South Africa, I didn't mention, but so I can assume that you have some opinions, at least, on Zimbabwe and how to tackle its despotic regime. Perhaps containment wouldn't work in the case of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, but what would you suggest?
Well, containment's not really relevant since he does not have territorial designs outside of Zimbabwe, and he's not supporting terrorist actions outside of the country. But he's clearly an appalling despot, and the sooner he leaves the scene, the better. South Africa has not behaved well under the Mbeki administration for reasons that I think historians will be puzzling over for a long time. It seems partly to do with Mbeki's personal relationship with Mugabe, partly to do with other things going on with Mbeki, but for whatever reason, South Africa has not put the same kind of pressure on Zimbabwe that it should have done. Again, I think, as when we were talking about counterterrorism, if outside players have any role to play, it's going to be through regional pressure, the local states in the region, financial pressure, sanctions, and so on. And hopefully, eventually, things will turn over there.
Is South Africa now then in a position to apply that kind of pressure under more of the leadership of Jacob Zuma, perhaps, to change Zimbabwe?
They certainly are in a position. It's a country that depends vitally on South Africa just for receiving imports from abroad. Indeed, last year, as I think you know, some South African trade unions and others stopped the passage of armaments to Zimbabwe that they had purchased. So
very quickly, though, we're down to our last few seconds. I just want to ask you personally how you feel about the split within the ANC. I mean, is this dangerous for the stability of the country, or is it something that you think could be good to have a more pluralistic democracy now in South Africa?
On the contrary, if it's really happening, I think it's not dangerous. South Africa has a single-party dominant democracy. That's not healthy for democracy. Democracy depends on political competition. There have been breakaway factions from the ANC before. Bantu Holomisa led one some years ago, and it came to nothing. We'll see whether this group can be better financed and can pose more of a competitive challenge to the Zuma government. But competition is the lifeblood of democracy.
Right. Professor Shapiro, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this edition of the interview. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us.
You're most welcome.
And thank our viewers for tuning in as well. That is all for tonight. Bonsoir.